Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. As those who are regulars to our regular conference know that occasionally we have presentations at times other than 11:30 a.m. on Thursdays, and we actually had to do that today because we had our faculty 2-for-1 for our summer interns. So it actually gives me great pleasure to introduce a colleague and friend who, when we found out he was going to be passing through Portland, we made sure that we could capture some of his knowledge and wisdom. And he's actually spoken in this room before, has had many luminaries in informatics in the field from around the country and the world. And he's going to talk about what I think is a real important and exciting new thing. And I know we have our summer interns here who are very new to the informatics field, but this is really important. In fact, I'm actually, instead of giving the usual introduction where I would tell you that he went to Stanford Medical School and he was the founding chair of the Department of Biomedical Informatics at the University of Arizona, I'm actually going to take a minute to let everyone know why I think this is important. And I really tried to get a bunch of faculty here, but Thursday afternoon in the summer, the faculty doesn't always succeed. But the work that Howard's going to talk about is one part, and then there's another part that's being done by someone that those who are faculty in the field know very well, Cindy Gadd from Vanderbilt. These are the first efforts to really try to define what people who work in the field of informatics do. And why is that important? Well, it's certainly important for the physician part of the field, which is part, although not all of the field, in terms of the kinds of things that they need to know when they are trained in informatics so they can go out and do their work. And the second piece, which he'll talk to, it hasn't, unlike his has been published. We all have access to it. It's actually, I think it's open access, so anyone can get to it. And then the second piece, so Howard's work focused on the clinical informatics subspecialty for physicians. And then Cindy Gadd's work is focusing on health informatics more broadly. Although one of the interesting things, I actually heard a version of this talk a couple months ago, but I'm looking forward to hearing it again, that there's actually a lot of parallels and some of the interesting comments. But the reason why I'm hoping that the faculty will really pay attention to this, or really anyone, is because this is not only a good snapshot of what's going on in the field, but it gives you a hint of where it's going and the kinds of things that we in the business of creating academic programs need to think about. I mean, fortunately, we actually cover a fair amount in our master's and PhD programs on what's in the list that they've uncovered. But there are things, and in fact, the program, at least while the faculty, maybe others, will probably have a retreat after the second paper is published so we can consider modifications to our curriculum and so forth. So anyways, I won't take too much of more of his time, but please listen, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of time for discussion.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Can all you hear me? Is the mic working in the back? Because I'm a mumbler. Okay, well, thank you, Bill, for that introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. It's a deja vu, but fortunately a pleasant one from my prior visit here. We won't go into that. So, yeah, as Bill said, I'm really here to convey kind of the data that's coming out of these studies. And as he mentioned, there are two sides of, quote unquote, of the house. AMIA has supported and put considerable time, effort, and money into two studies. One is the CIS, Clinical Informatics Subspecialty Study, to define what that field is. Just a word about the other is health informatics, which is everybody that doesn't qualify for the physician pathway. So health informatics does include physicians, particularly physicians who, for example, might have not maintained their primary board certification, so they're not eligible to sit for the exam through the practice pathway or get into a fellowship, or if strange outliers, like if you did a DO residency, that's not recognized by the American Board of Medical Specialties, et cetera. So HI side, I had the easy job because we have a defined, delimited population with email addresses. Cindy's study on the HI side was much more complicated because they had an undefined population that was very broad. I'm going to touch on a little bit of the HI stuff. I'm not really, I wasn't centrally involved in that, but I have gotten Cindy's permission to reuse some of her slides. And this is an evolving story, and hopefully will be. So just quickly on the CIS side, the original work was done by the famous Gardner Paper, a whole group of people that wrote 2 papers in around 2009, published them on the core content of clinical informatics and the program requirements for clinical informatics fellowships. And it is essentially a knowledge taxonomy that's quite robust and almost unusable because some things are there covered in depth, some things aren't. It was also pretty much an expert opinion. It was just kind of a group of people got together, primarily academics, to create it. The good news is that it got us started, and it's not optimal, but it's good. So after 10 years, turns out the field's changed a little bit in 10 years. Plus, it became more and more apparent that we needed a more robust, defensible methodology by which we could define the field. And there is an industry standard called practice analysis, but it always, to me, felt a little bit more like we were trying to figure out how to create a platypus, you know. It was tough to get your arms around what this really meant. So I'm going to walk you through kind of the methodology and some of the results. Please pipe up and ask questions as we go, but try to have a somewhat high threshold for questions so we don't get too bogged down. And then we have microphones, or I'll repeat the questions if we need to, because I know this is being videocast. So here are my learning objectives. I won't read through these. Yeah. So we're going to talk about the practice analysis methodology and the differences between the 2 studies. This is a Doug Fridsman slide, which I love the graphic on here, so I wantonly stole it from him. Clinical informatics specialist, because freaking miracle worker is an official job title. And there is this concern, without a definition of the field, not only can't we align our training programs with the certification exam, but we can't tell the US government what the job is that an informatician does, and there's some benefits of having federal job codes and so on, especially for workforce development. So what we wanted to do was a systematic analysis, and it turns out that this is common in other industries. And there are consultants who do this for a living who know what they're doing. So we wrote an RFP, we put it out for consultants, got several bids back, we looked through it all, and we decided to partner with ACT Pro Exam. Some of you may have taken the ACT exam, right, for college. So that's a big outfit, and they know what they're doing. And they were just the best consultants I've ever worked with, and I don't say that more than once per lifetime. All right. Okay, so there's 2 elements. One is a structured consensus process to develop the delineation of practice. Now this is going to be, we're going to come back to this, we're going to pause a little on these terms, for domains, tasks, and knowledge and skills. And knowledge and skills I'm going to just probably refer to as either KS or knowledge. So again, I mentioned the Gardner paper was a knowledge document. What really matters to us in training programs are what does the fellow need to be able to do, right? Or the dissertation student, the PhD or master's student. And it then needs to be validated by going out to people who are actually doing that and say, does this sound right? Is there something wrong here? Is there something missing? Something not clear? So those are the 2 elements of the methodology. To inform, as I mentioned, training requirements and eligibility requirements for certification. Defensibility of an assessment program, meaning how can we assess a learner if we don't know what they're supposed to know or what they're supposed to be able to do. So knowing that really helps to do the assessment part. Certification examination specs we talked about. And AMIA took a leadership role in this, and I don't own stock in AMIA, and I'm not trying to like sell their goods, but they really did make a significant investment of effort, intellectual effort, staff time, and finances. And this was the CIS and the HI studies are both AMIA board approved documents. So this has gone through a tremendous amount of scrutiny. It was really fun doing all that. I can't tell you how much fun that was. All right. On the CIS side, to support it through the organizations listed, CISCOP, for those that don't know, is the Clinical Informatics Community of Practice. This is all the people who have passed the subspecialty exam. That's the CIS side. CCIPD is the Clinical Informatics Program Director Group, fellows, and ABPM, the American Board of Preventive Medicine, who administers the examination. Cindy's side of the house on health informatics certification, and there is not currently a certifying body for that, so this is the first step to being able to provide a certification infrastructure, is to create the delineation of practice that says here's what it is to be a health informatician, then create the certifying body, then create the exam, and then getting people through the pipeline. Okay, and I've already covered this. The practice analysis was the update to Gardner. And this is, again, data-driven process, robust process to come up with these. And this is the unofficial emblem of the program director organization. And I understand, Bill, we're to be credited for this round hole. Ramon was a polished performer, but this was sheer madness as a square peg in a round hole, unassisted and blindfolded. So this really if you want to be an informatician, you've got to master this act in many cases. Now, up at the top, that hyperlink, and I'm hoping that these slides will be available. If not, you can always email me. But if you click through, that'll take you directly to the CIS article, which was published back in May. There are supplements to that article, the digital supplements, that have the full delineation of practice and the data on which it was based. So if you want to take a look at that, it's easy to get to. The health informatics is in process of being written. The delineation, the work is all done. They're writing it up. It's a much more complicated thing to write up, so they hope to have that out by the November AMIA meeting, and it looks like it'll be after, I've been told, after the first of the year, not too far after that. It'll probably look a lot like this, obviously different data and different process, and we're going to cover a little bit of that. Okay, so our aims were, again, to articulate the tasks and competencies used in practice, and then the skills and knowledge that support that practice. So what do you do? That's what I want to ask everybody. What do you do day to day? The blueprints, exam blueprints, and then as a former recovering fellowship director, this should be a closed loop, right? So it should have the delineation of practice, dictates what the fellowship accreditations require the fellows be taught. That is aligned with the examination certification process, and that is aligned with subsequent maintenance of certification after you've been certified. Simple. I mean, what could be easier? And that's the last point, is the maintenance of certification. So we conducted this in 2.5 phases. Phase 1 was convening a practice analysis task force. So what we did is we sent to the entire CICOP list. So we sent to all currently certified CIS diplomats an invitation to become involved in this process. We asked them for a bunch of information about their current job role, where they are, the usual kinds of things, and which of the following would you be interested in. And there were, you'll see in a minute, I have a graphic that I think makes it a little clearer. There were a variety of different groups that we formed. Now, we spent a long time picking these 12 subject matter experts so that they were diverse in every aspect we could think of. Different locations, some worked for VA, some were vendors, some were academics, gender, you name it, everything we could think of to get what we thought was going to be a really robust and diverse panel. Because obviously this group is critical. They're coming up with this initial delineation of practice. There's going to be subsequent refinement of that. But they have to land somewhere in the landing zone, right? Or it's not going to work, which we did. And it turned out, in retrospect, we did a really good job because this group was amazing. One of the people who is a full-time academician, as he was leaving the meeting, I said, what did you think of the process and the outcome? He said, these people are amazing. I had no idea that these people existed out there, because he's pretty much more pure academics, but he was very complimentary. So that was a good sign, that there was agreement about how well this group did. So the group brainstormed domains. What are the major domains? By the definition, the domain should be mutually exclusive, but comprehensive, the union of which should represent the whole field, right? Then under each domain, tasks, and then knowledge and skills. The consultants did a really nice job. We shoveled a ton of information to them. Every article we could find, we gave them a variety of different subject matter experts and people in the field who knew the history, other people who had various types of jobs, and they interviewed all these people, and they came up with a several-page briefing document for the face-to-face meeting that this group had to establish that initial draft delineation of practice. The idea was then in phase 2, we refine that, then we take that delineation of practice and we send it out to the CIS diplomat community and say, does this look right? And we'll go into how we did that in detail in just a second. So we want to verify that there's this updated core content, and we wanted to gather data for downstream use, quote-unquote downstream use cases, which is fellowship training requirements to be changed, fellowship milestones to be updated, maintenance of certification, the things I mentioned earlier. But we knew this was a one-time chance to add questions. On the other hand, if we added too many questions, no one would complete the survey. So this was an interesting balancing act. And this is where having a good consultant who has done this like a lot was really, really helpful at where to put the set point on that. So my apologies, it's a little small maybe in the back of the room, but get out your binoculars. I'll walk you through this. So this was the CIS overview of the process. The project was initiated at the AMIA level with the selection of the consultant. There was an oversight, kind of an executive steering group to this operation. That's the group I was asked to chair. Then there were 12 practice analysis task force members, PATF, secondary review panel, and a pilot survey review panel. Okay, so what happened during phase 1 was that the PATF met for this 2-day meeting, which was in Chicago, and I remember coming out of that meeting and I couldn't find the elevator. That's how neurochemically drained I was, but it was actually really fun. I mean, I don't know why I would think this was fun, but it was really cool to be really wrestling with this, these questions, and the amount of talent in the room was unbelievable. Okay, that then went out to a second independent secondary review panel. Okay, another group of SMEs who we had also chosen for that same diversity requirement. They got feedback. This isn't clear, this is missing, this shouldn't be there, and then we had a whole process to refine that feedback, brought it back to the PATF to say, okay, what do you think of this input? PATF looked at it, comes to the oversight panel. There are many internal approvals I haven't depicted here. And that led us to the composition of a draft delineation of practice, which included the domains, tasks, and knowledge statements, which I'll show you the numbers in a second. That then was put into a survey instrument, which I'm going to talk about also in a minute, was sent to a third independent group of SMEs to say, look at this, does the survey instrument work? Can you navigate it? Is this too long to send out? Is there something else that's missing? Should we be asking the questions in a different way? It was more kind of testing the survey methodology rather than asking for their actual survey input. Then it went out to all CIS diplomats, with the exception of anybody who had touched it along the pathway to its generation, right? So I got a link. It went out to all CIS diplomats through the ABPM and AB Path, the American Board of Pathology. So I got a link to it, and I called the consultant and said, do I fill this out? And they said, no, you can't fill it out. You've already had your skin in the game. Okay, so, and that led to the composition of this final DOP, which then went to the board of directors at AMIA for final approval, which we got last November. So the question that we had was, how many are going to return this survey? We figured it would take about 45 minutes to an hour. These are all really busy people. We had hoped, our dream was to get 300 back from the 1695. And as you can see, we actually exceeded that by a little bit. Now, I was initially kind of disappointed because it's like 80% of people didn't return this. But in talking with the consultants, it was interesting. They said that usually they average about 4 to 10% return. So they thought this was fabulous. They did some statistical calculations and felt that even at that level, they were pretty confident that these were results we could defend. Now, what we would like to have done was take our demographics, which is extensive, take the demographic analysis of the respondents, and that included things like job title and role and all that kind of stuff, and compare it to the full 1695 ABM-PM diplomats. Guess who has that data? Nobody. Turned out the ABPM had no data on these candidates at all, except for what year they graduated medical school. Please don't repeat that in public. I'm not trying to criticize ABPM. It was amazing that they got the thing off the ground in the first place anyway. It's not surprising they forgot the Nesquik, when they got to the moon. But so we had the comparable analysis was just not even possible. It probably still is, and I still don't think they're gathering that much data. But we felt pretty confident that we could take these results forward with confidence. We did, however, bring the demographic comparison, the demographic snapshot that we did have from our survey respondents. We brought that back to the PATF and say, take a look at this. Does this look reasonable? Do you think this is like way out of line, like there's way too many people at the VA or way too many people in academics or whatever? And PATF said, no, we think this is us. We think it's good. That gave us some confidence that we could move forward to refine this. So I mentioned the survey itself. I was going to ask for a show of hands of how many of you completed this, but I know you're all in training, and I don't want to embarrass Bill and Vishnu. So, okay, so these are the questions we asked. How frequently did you perform this task? This is for tasks, right? And how important? So something that's performed infrequently, but it's very important, you want to know about. So we got all this data back on all the tasks. It turned out there were 42 tasks and about 142 knowledge statements. So imagine doing the survey. It seems simple, these two questions, but you're doing it across roughly 170 statements. It was, it took time, in addition to all the demographic questions. Now, for survey knowledge, the consultants always call this knowledge and skill. To me, this is knowledge. Skills are tasks, but anyway, nomenclature. We asked a variety of questions. Again, frequency, which we asked for tasks, but we didn't ask how important is the knowledge. We asked two other questions. What level of mastery of the knowledge should be required at the time of certification, which is a surrogate for saying what should be taught in fellowships, because the time of certification will be at the end of your fellowship. Now, in the practice pathway, which is still open, you can take the exam without a fellowship, but that's going to close in a year or two. So this was important feedback for informing after use case of program requirement revisions for accrediting, planning and implementing and accrediting informatics fellowships. And then we specifically asked, how important is this to include in a fellowship? It's kind of a little bit redundant. This question was given to all program directors. So we knew who the program directors were. We sent them that question. And in fact, what we had to do, because we didn't want to ask 3 questions across 170-something things to all respondents, the consultants had seen this before. They said, oh, this is easy. We just create 2 versions of the survey. We ask everybody frequency of use. But 1/2 of them get level of mastery. The other half get this. 1/2 gets the question on the left. The other half gets the question on the right. So that worked out pretty well. And it turned out, as you see by the respondents, we had pretty even distribution between those 2. Okay. So the final delineation of practice was looking at what we got on the returns, primarily on frequency and importance for the purposes of this delineation. And the mean frequency ratings had to be 2.5 or more, at least rarely to occasionally, and importance ratings of 3 or more. And I'm going to go back for a second. If you look at frequency, see frequency has 5 choices. Let me go back to the prior slide. And importance has 4. That's why there's a little difference in kind of the point thing. Okay, and here's what we came up with. I mentioned the 42 and 139. Now, this for the first time shows you the domain structure. So domain 1, fundamentals. There are no tasks in it's basic knowledge. So there are no tasks in domain 1. Improving care delivery outcomes, enterprise information systems. I won't read them. They're there. Okay, so this was, and you can see that there's pretty good distribution of tasks and knowledge statements across these 4 domains, which again, mutually exclusive. I also on the back end created a little cheat sheet, which was a map of the task statements to knowledge statements. So there usually were several knowledge statements that supported a task. So internally, we also have a map, that map as well. That will be useful for fellowship and training programs to know for this task, this is the knowledge we have to teach them to do that task, the prerequisite knowledge, or at least think about it. Okay. So as I said, this is kind of like the core content 2.0, whatever you want to call it. But for the first time now includes task information, not just knowledge. So that was new. The other thing that we saw as a definite pattern was that data analytics and data governance turns out to be important. Duh. So when we're in the middle of doing this, the program directors are all frantically calling me saying, well, not calling, but saying, oh my God, how am I going to have to change my whole fellowship curriculum? It's like, no, relax. Because the fellowship directors already know that this is important and are already teaching it. So most of, if not all the fellowships were already forward-leaning and knew that they had to teach this stuff, even though it was never specified. Of the 58 or 59 sub-competencies that are required to teach fellows in these accredited fellowships, 1 on data, analyze and query data. I mean, it's unbelievable to me. Okay, so this reflects the current state of the art, too, where data is becoming really, really important. Okay, so let me pause for a second. Pause, that refreshes. Before we head into health informatics, any questions about, I know I went kind of really quickly through this. Okay, you're still with me, right? Away we go. Okay, now into health informatics, which I'm going to credit Cindy Gadd for. We had a mutual agreement pact that we could use each other's slides. But basically, she had this. She even had a rounder peg and a squarer hole to do this because of the diversity and the lack of a really defined population within health informatics. So they cast the net very broadly. And for those of you that have been following the play-by-play over the last couple of years, this has been a very difficult and arduous effort to get this thing put together. Okay, so this is a new certification. So there's nothing available at the moment. There are things available, but there's no standard really like we had with Gardner. Like it or not, at least it was something you could push against. There's an implication of this that's very important. There is a certifying body and a certifying process for the physician side. That's American Board of Preventive Medicine. There's currently no certifying body. There's no one that administers the exam for this future credential. And so that's something that AMIA is really trying to work out, because there are all sorts of requirements for one to be able to call oneself a certifying entity. And if AMIA becomes that certifying entity, then they cannot conduct review courses to prepare you for the exam that they're certifying, right? That's an ethical problem. There has to be a firewall built between. So in the case of the physicians, the American Board of Preventive Medicine administers this exam, OHSU, Stanford, others, and AMIA can provide review courses. That's fine, as long as you don't have exam item writers going back and forth between the two. The audience is more diverse, as I've said over and over again. By the way, that audience is not nurses and pharmacists. That audience is everybody. Master's level people, PhDs, everybody that does work in informatics. It's a very big tent. Now, we talked about this. We decided not to do this on the physician side, except for that level of mastery prior to certification. But they very explicitly looked at the difference between mid-career and advanced practitioners, trying to glean some insights about what tasks and knowledge are required earlier in your career, what's required later, because of the diversity of that audience. That makes a big difference in some professions and not in others. It doesn't make that big a difference for the physicians. It does for the HI side. Okay, so this is the slide I showed you earlier. This is the CIS slide, and now quick change. This is the HI practice. Looks pretty familiar, right? The things that are different are these. So they added yet another level, which is the focus panels and secondary review panels. Where are they? Yeah, that's there. Actually, I have a little error on that slide. So what they wound up realizing is that they needed such broad input, they couldn't just they couldn't get enough people on any one group to do that. So they added and spun out 3 additional focus panels. I think these were specialty specific. I'm not aware of the details of these, to take a look at those aspects and be sure they all lined up. I think it was a good move because it gave them an extra level of due diligence to be sure they were trying to be as broad as they could in terms of points of view being harvested and collated. The rest of it, same. Secondary review panel, survey, practice analysis survey, final DOP, right? This went on and just concluded last January. That's why they're a little bit behind us in terms of getting this written up. And had a lot more. We had 25 SMEs and volunteers across those 4 panels. They had 60. Because they intentionally needed to have a lot more constituencies represented. So you can imagine choreographing all that. Since they had no defined group to send the survey to, they partnered with a lot of different organizations to get the survey out. So, and they often, they sent the survey link to them and then they send it on to their members. So they didn't even know how many went out. They knew what they got back, but they didn't know what the denominator was. So there's no percentage, on that 1,011 return surveys. It's hard to know what the N is on the bottom. But nonetheless, a significant number of completed surveys, which was great. And here's just a kind of high-level snapshot of the respondents for the HI's primary domains. Medicine, I'm assuming, means physicians. Usually that's what that would mean. that, again, as I said earlier, might not have access to the certification pathway through the American Board of Preventive Medicine. And then public health, pharmacy, nursing, others. And HI not related to a specific health domain probably means people that are not don't have clinical backgrounds. That's what that would account for, and that's a significant number as well. That might be people who have training in a master's degree or a PhD in informatics who are working in various capacities in the field. Okay, so the task ratings were the same as the CIS PA showed you earlier, frequency and importance. Then they also asked, under knowledge and skills, some additional questions. Well, frequency, again, same. But then instead of the what level of mastery should it be on fellowships, they added this question, who needs to know this? And this is the career stage question. And again, for knowledge, not for tasks. If you look at the final delineation of practice, again, not published, but this has already been presented in other meetings. I'm going to show you this side by side with CIS, but I'll just tell you that independently the domain structure looked curiously the same. Now that gave me a good feeling. Like it was like totally different. You'd really wonder what's wrong with this picture, right? So it's kind of reassuring that it looked somewhat the same. The thing that was remarkable is that there are significantly more task statements. There's 74 and about the same number of knowledge statements. And let me put these, I think the next one is, oh no, yeah. So there were a lot more, so I asked specifically, since I wasn't directly involved in this, how come there's so many more task statements? And the staff and Cindy said, we're not sure. We think it's probably because of the stage of career that the PATF for the health informatics side really tried to be much more broad, covering a lot more territory between different professions and different levels. And so that initiated a lot more task statements. It was interesting that the knowledge statements were, in terms of numbers, were about the same. Okay, so I've covered this already, but just to recap, these are the downstream use cases for the CIS. We have subsequently then, with AMIA's support and encouragement, convened a group of program directors. I asked for, there are 37 accredited programs, CIS fellowship programs as of 2 weeks ago, changes daily. But we had 8 volunteers who agreed to go through the entire CIS delineation of practice and say, do we need to keep this for fellows? Should this be required of fellows? What should be required of fellows? Do we need to reword any of these statements? And spent days and days doing this. That went out to a second group of 4 program directors to look and critique at what the original group of program directors have done. So this actually is already done. That we've prepared a summary of the process and the results to go to the RC as an input into the training program requirements revisions, which we hope will happen in 2020. And of course, with the HI side, same kind of thing. They specifically mention educational program accreditation requirements. That's the equivalent of the CIS fellowship accreditation requirements. And so as Dr. Hirsch mentioned, this has potential implications. Hard to know whether this will be a ship in the night or whether this will become a standard that educational programs will look to adhere to. That remains to be seen. Certainly it should inform, from AMIA's perspective, their programming and CIS and HI curricula, career roadmaps. And then the big interesting part we've all been waiting for is, what's the crosswalk? How do these 2 delineations of practice compare? And is there some kind of Venn in which some stuff is really pretty much the same that overlaps, and there's some stuff that's different? And if so, is it a little Venn? Is it a big Venn? How's that going to look? So that's currently underway. I was asked by AMIA not to disclose that because it hasn't really matured yet. And secondly, the HI study is not yet published. So as I said, that'll come out in January, and we hope to have this crosswalk done and probably be published in the spring of next year. Oh, I did put them side by side. So here, I'm not going to read this, but if you glance up and down, you'll see that there's a striking similarity to the 2 the domain structure of the 2. In fact, they're really no different except for a couple words here and there. Very interesting. You can, if you want to get more into it, say, okay, well, where are the differences in numbers? And the biggest one was in domain 3 on health informatics, had a huge number of task statements, had over twice as many task statements as, or almost twice as many as the enterprise information systems under the CIS domain. So there is a correspondence between these 2. So I also asked the question, since CIS went first and then HI, did they just copy off of our paper? I mean, what happened there in that room? And they said no. They had access to the CIS delineation practice, but they intentionally went about the exercise de novo and then did kind of a back and forth a little bit to see kind of if they wanted to borrow anything from the HI side. They also used the Gardner document, as we did, as an input, so it's not surprising that the knowledge statements would tend to look somewhat more similar. Okay, so we imagine, in addition to the use cases I mentioned, that there's a lot of interesting things that could come of this to help educational programs focus, to help employers focus. Because if I'm sitting looking to hire either a health informatics person or a clinical informatics subspecialist, I now have a job description that I can choose from. You know, here's 42 skills that you should have. Well, I don't expect that of everybody, so here are the most important ones in our organization for this level of hire. So maybe you don't have to know how, you know, project management or governance and all that kind of stuff, but you should know the data analytics part if we're hiring data analytics. So it gives you a menu to choose from for job descriptions. And overall, will strengthen the profession. We had a little exercise earlier with the fellows about, can you do a 10 or 15-second explanation of what it is you do? And I would challenge anybody to do that, but it's not easy. And I said this morning, my kid's always said he's a doctor and he does other stuff we don't understand. So that's not an adequate explanation of what it is you do if you're talking with friends, neighbors, and employers. Okay, so that's really my comments for today, and I'll kind of, how are we doing on time? We got plenty of time for questions, and I know I went through this pretty quickly, and it's in some ways not exactly super exciting, but it has huge implications for all of us in the room. So, yes, please. I think we have time to wait for the mic to travel.
Thank you for your talk. For those of us who may be less familiar with where the clinical informatics fellowships are physically based, as what kind of institutions they're at, could you perhaps talk a little bit about whether there's any differences in what you see the respondents saying based on the demographics? You know, is somebody at an East Coast academic health center responding very differently for compared to a clinical informatics program that might be in a more networked, rural, or mixed kind of community? Do you have any sense of demographic differences in the needs?
The answer is no. There's no difference. At least on the CIS side, the consultants did extensive subgroup analyses based on age, based on location. They could not determine any statistically significant differences. Obviously, you have to roll up the data, so there could be isolated instances of outliers, but that was actually reassuring, that we didn't see some big trend where the East Coast is entirely different than the West Coast in terms of how they define their task and knowledge and skill requirements. I believe it was done on the HI side. I just don't know for sure. And before I forget, your question also reminded me of another point. It's very interesting when you do the crosswalk, looking at the initial crosswalk, we run into a terminology issue. I wouldn't say it's a problem, but everywhere on the CIS side, it says clinical informatics. Everywhere on the HI side, it says health informatics. So we're going to have some like process, maybe a tug of war or something, I don't know, to figure out what the term is that we use. And because it's like medical informatics, no, it's clinical informatics. Okay, everybody's cool with that. No, we're not cool with that. Now it's got to be health informatics. So I don't know, maybe we'll just agree to disagree and, you know, have some cross map that says, you know, health/clinical informatics. But there's that difference too that we'll have to look at if the data's further analyzed. So yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. Dr. Hirsch.
Question. As you you know, correctly stated, the emergence of the fifth domain of data analytics and governance is no surprise at all. Were there any things though that were surprises? You know, in terms of, you know, because I think we all have a kind of general idea of what informaticians do in hospitals and so forth. But was there anything that stood out? And then maybe a second question is, are there any things that you think are important trends in the field that didn't show up? And you know, because we're taking a snapshot in time, which is already, what, a year old. You know, are there new things coming down the pike?
Yeah, both good questions. And actually, there's one answer for both. So there really wasn't anything that was terribly surprising. That was like oh, we never thought of that. When we convened the CIS PATF, we said, we want you to think about now and the next 5 years, roughly. Next 5 to 10, but more like now to 5 years, with the thought that this should be repeated every 5 to 10 years, probably in informatics more on the earlier side, because of the rate of change. So we want you to be forward-leaning. So there were a couple things on the CIS side that were in there that got very low frequency and importance ratings. So I'll give you 2 examples I had mentioned earlier to the group. International clinical informatics was a knowledge thing that was carried over from Gardner. That was in the original DOP. On the survey, it got like 0 ratings. So if you ask the average CMIO, how important is international clinical informatics and how often do you use that? It's always 0, right? So that we decided to strike because we thought that was good information and we'll take it out. By the way, all the strikes were not done by me or by the consultants. It was done, all that was brought back to the PATF with a set of, here's the data, here's our thinking on it, what do you think? There were originally 142 knowledge statements, and so we refined some of them. Those were left out. What was interesting were the forward-leaning ones. They also got low importance and frequency. Example, social determinants of health, incorporating bioinformatics data into the EHR. There are a couple others like that are clearly important. They should be kept, even though they're forward-leaning. So you get into interesting dynamic. So we brought all this back to the PATF, and without trying to prejudice them, we said no. So here's one we think we should eliminate. Here's others we should discuss. What do you think? And everybody said we need to leave these in because they're not what physician informaticians are doing today, but it's not that far. It's probably before the next redo of this that'll come into the fore. So that was actually kind of cool. Now, what was surprising to me was in some conversations with the ABPM, they were not happy about that because they said, well, if they're not doing that, we don't know how to test them. And I had to remind them that they can decide to test whatever they want. No, they don't have to do that. We're going to keep it in the delineation practice. It's up to you guys to decide where the focus is for the actual examination. So this year you might not test it. Next year you might say, oh, now we have enough of that stuff going on that we can write some test questions. So yeah, but beyond that, there wasn't anything super surprising. I think probably the real value wasn't so much that we discovered something new, but I think we put it into a very robustly, first of all, we had a process that we think now backs it up as not being someone's opinion or just a small group of people's opinion. And the number of sanding and polishing of wording is unbelievable how much work went into refining the statements to be as clear as possible and as brief as possible. So that's a little bit new. Yeah, and the other, of course, is just having a task list, which we never had before. But no other shockers. I don't know, you probably have glanced through the CIS delineation. I don't know if there was anything that struck you.
Yeah, I didn't drill really into the details.
Yeah. I don't want to put you on the spot for having memorized it. What's number 42? But no, I don't think there's anything that's surprising. That's why I said I didn't think the program director should be too worried about it because they're already doing this stuff. Plus, most of us who have had site visits, the site visitors know nothing about informatics. And mine said, so what are you all doing here? Computers? So it's like, okay, this is going to be a great visit. So we're still way better than where the ACGME is. Other questions or comments? He's got one, I think. Okay, Joan and then Vishnu.
Thank you for such a clear presentation. I was on Reed Gardner's committee for developing the original core competencies, and we kept in mind through the entire process CMIOs, CMIOs, CMIOs. And I suspect this is much broader than that. I'm wondering what you kept in mind the whole time you were going through your process for the CIS piece of it.
Well, I would say diversity. So you were wanting to. My understanding of that group, it was more academicians, so you had to really kind of work a little bit to remember, wait a second, there's a broader constituency. We subverted that need by just having them in the room, which is really quite remarkable. And we didn't know if it was going to work. We didn't know, if you choose the wrong people in terms of either what they're representing, which part of the universe they're representing, or they're creepy people, or they've got to be in their bonnet about, fire, or some specific thing, but we didn't get any of that. So that was really amazing. That's what I was most concerned about, that we get a loser group. There was one person at ours who was disruptive, and it just took some basic group management to straighten that out pretty quick. That always happens. So, no, you're not in that group. You're over there. Remember, sit down, please. So, it was innocent. It was well-intentioned. So, it's a good question. Yeah. I can't comment for Cindy. I don't know. I know it was obviously a more complex environment. I know they struggled immensely more than we did about the diversity of representation with good cause. Yeah. Dr. Moen.
So my question is, now that you're like done with the process and you have a sense of this, how often do you think we should be doing this as a specialty? I mean, typically for GME, we do these kind of updates to the clinical field. That's usually in cycles of 10 years or 15 years. I mean, clearly informatics kind of works in dog years. So as we've seen from 2009 to now, the field has grown a lot. So what's the optimum time to be doing this exercise again to get current with the field?
Yeah, so this is a good question. And of course, we asked our consultants, what do you think is the industry standard for this? And they said it really varies depending on how fast a field is changing. And they agreed that from everything they had learned through the process, informatics is more rather than less changing. What we put in our article was we recommended every 7 to 10 years. I probably would have myself said every 5 to 7, but it is an arduous process to go through, number one. Number two, the ABPM will freak out if they get a new exam blueprint mandate every 5 years. It takes them 3 years to create an exam. It's a lot of work. Now that will get easier, and I asked, when Chris Lehman was still there, I asked him, is there anything here that's so outlandish that you won't be able to cover it on an exam? He said, no, this is actually reassuring because I think we have content already, questions already. So it may be as simple in the exam part of it, it's just reclassifying the questions and mapping them to but probably every 5 to 7 years. I think we put in the paper 7 to 10, just to be a little bit on not to put anybody's feet to the fire. I would not wait 10. It's way too long. We'll probably have to for the program requirements, but those are loosey-goosey anyway. You have a lot of leeway as a program director to work around some stuff there. And maybe it'll slow down. I mean, maybe we've seen the rapid change between 2009 and now because of the stimulus bill and all the amazing activity that went on around EHR introduction. So we may also see us slowing down. So that has to be kind of a calculation of how much is it going to cost in terms of time and money. How fast is the field changing? Does it still feel like it's representative? We'll see. Fortunately, I'm dropping the mic. Yeah. My favorite expression used to be, how hard can that be? Now it's, how hard can that be and what can possibly go wrong with this plan? And that's the difficulty when you get into this kind of stuff. It's to come up with a methodology that's efficient but robust, that's defensible, meaningful, it's tricky. We were, I think, in some ways fortunate that it kind of landed, in one piece.
I don't want to hog the microphone if other people have questions, but seeing no others for right now. There's a bunch of people in this room, not only the current trainees, but others who are wondering, and you may or may not know this, what the sort of next steps are for the exam, incorporating this into the exam. It's not only are people going to be taking it at some point soon, but those who do board review courses and advise people. Do you know what ABPM and whoever else, ACGME, have planned in terms of changing the exam?
I can give you, this is not accurate to 10 decimal places. I'm remembering a conversation with Adi, who inherited Chris's position as chief of the exam. He said it'll take 2 to 3 years to retool the exam. And they could probably do the exam faster, but they have to have enough time to get a new blueprint out to the people that are going to be taking the exam. They need to have time for people who are offering review courses to readjust to that blueprint. So the whole, as you know better than anybody, there's a whole series of steps that does require some lead time. It could be done faster, but it would short circuit a lot of those other steps, which would be a problem.
It's interesting though, because the blueprint for the first exam was basically the reproducing the table that was in the Gardner paper, and that won't be the case because we're actually thinking with the board review course that the exam is going to change significantly next year. Not this current year, but in 2020.
It could that early. It's possible. I don't know. By the way, we gave the ABPM. So we also asked questions to establish an exam blueprint. So what an exam blueprint is amongst these domains that I showed you earlier, what percentage of questions should be within each of those domains, totaling 100, obviously, 100%. So we asked the respondents, should this be on a certification examination? And then we asked them separately, amongst these domains, what percentage should each of these be on an exam blueprint? So we had 2 ways of looking at that data. We compiled that, and we intentionally, at ABPM's request, left it out of the article, which I think was the right move. because ABPM didn't want anything in print that might be misinterpreted as an ABPM endorsed exam blueprint. So, but that was all that data was given to the ABPM, and in their mysterious processes, they will, under some unspecified time frame, cook it up. But I think people like Adi and so on, I know that they've got to be chewing on this, and they've got to probably be extending some kind of work plan. I'm not sure what their plans are in terms of communication about what that timeline is. You have to ask them. But there's a clear map of the process ahead, how long it's going to take. Anybody's guess. But I remember him saying to me 2 to 3 years, just because of the other things I mentioned, which are attached, not just the exam.
So
clear as mud.
Data analytics isn't important for 2 or 3 more years now.
Yeah. Well, that's the good part is we're all teaching it because we know it's important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, what I found, it's funny because, we were, the first year we did the board review course, our sort of oracle of knowledge was Ben Munger, who, helped develop the subspecialty and had, previously developed the emergency medicine subspecialty. And he's like, there will be, there won't be much new things, things that are relatively recent. You may have heard me tell this story. So the first year of the board review course, we really kind of played down meaningful use, even though it was 2013 or 2014, I can't, one of those years. But so, meaningful use had been around for a few years, but there was nothing in the outline that talked about it. So we said to the people taking the board review course, don't really worry, about meaningful use. So sure enough, when I go to take the exam myself, about the 3rd or 4th question in, there's a question about stage 2 meaningful use, which had just started.
Yeah, you're probably looking to be sure you're not going to get hit by lightning.
Yeah, but in reality, you can even go back into the original Gardner categories, and kind of tease out things that are happening now that you want, that you could attribute to things that are in it back then. So, I'm sure the exam, and we know for a fact the exam has evolved, maybe it will evolve before all the new study guides and everything come out.
Yeah, and we know that, the reality is that very few people are going to get 100% on a board certificate, any kind of certifying exam. So there are going to be things like that either escaped your awareness when you were going through your studies, it wasn't covered, or you just didn't know it was going to be on an exam. But obviously, ABPM doesn't want to get too specific, so that's why they're going to just release percentages in each domain, and then but at least now, you'll be able to see what is in that domain. And ABPM could go off-road and create questions that aren't tied to those tasks or knowledge statements, but my sense is they probably have a big incentive to be sure that, so you'd have an outer circle of what they, with the exception of these evolving things. So this is similar to that thing I mentioned earlier about these evolving areas, and when they might, since it's in the DOP, when they might put in questions about that, like your example, meaningful use is exactly the same thing. I don't know. Just depends when they divine that it's now relevant enough and frequent enough to, in their opinion, include on the exam. So, yes.
I just have a quick favor to ask of you. I think a lot of people in this room are at various levels of experience and history with the field of informatics, and you all have dropped a lot of names and not necessarily helped us understand. So, I know who Reed Gardner is, but I'm not sure that everybody else in the room does. And you keep talking about Adi, who's chairing the new exam committee. But who is that, and what's their background, and where are they located? I think giving us a little bit of that might help us understand who's shaping our field in these ways. So
Joy mentioned that she worked with Reed Gardner. I personally don't know Reed Gardner, but his paper is frequently referred to as the Gardner Paper. So in that respect, I would say if you go back to our recently published paper, was published in November, that I had that link up there. And actually, let me just quickly go all the way back, so in case you didn't.
And just to clarify, I mean, we call it the Gardner Paper because Reed Gardner was the first author. There were a lot of people involved, Joan and others. So really, we should be saying the original core content outline and not the Gardner Paper. But for whatever reason, University of Utah. He was the chair of the informatics program there. But he was just the kind of chair of the committee, and there were many others in the field, many names you would recognize.
Yeah. So that article is referenced here. And the article we wrote has a fair amount of history of all this stuff and how these organizations came together. Your point is well taken. I don't know, I can't pronounce Adi's last name, otherwise I would have given you his full name, but really substitute for Adi the chair of the ABPM exam committee. That's the role that he occupies. It's not him that's that important, but that's that group. So ABPM, American Board of Preventive Medicine, has multiple subboards for clinical informatics. There is a chair, a vice chair of the exam committee, and there are about 20 people that write items for them.
So he himself is a preventive medicine physician?
No. No, because you can become certified in clinical informatics irrespective of specialty. You just have to have had an ABMS primary specialty or fellowship. So I think he's an internist, yeah. And that previously was Chris Lehman, who's a neonatal intensive guy at Vanderbilt. So, you know, what's so cool, I think, about the field is that the leadership of the field it's pan-specialty. I am a family physician, and I was program director for an internal medicine fellowship, which meant I had to go back to the Graduate Medical Education Committee that I had served on 20 years prior as a family medicine director. I was now introducing myself as the new program director for an internal medicine subspecialty program, which if you told me I would be doing that in 20 years, I would have shot myself, you know, with disbelief. And there's a term for it, the RC calls us mongrel program director. So there's lots of people in terms of specialty, and I'm expanding on that because it's important to know that that's one of the things that makes the discipline so interesting and so confusing. But it's a point well taken in terms of the, I don't mean to be like speaking like an insider, because I'm definitely not. Yeah. So again, all the details there are much more well written than my talk is, but if you really want to get into the weeds, and then somewhere around January, I'm sure, I think Amy is going to do a kind of whole big reveal of the AHIC structure. I don't know if they'll have the certification process worked out by then or not. So stay tuned. And I'm sure there'll probably be some updates at the November meeting. I'm not sure how much they're going to want to reveal at that point. Okay, so 1 minute to spare. I'm just going to thank Bill and Vishnu for bringing me here, and thank all of you for attending today, for participating. And I want to wish you all well in your interesting new pathways through the informatics universe. Good luck, everybody. Yeah.